friends, welcome to another episode of Making Disciples. Today on our podcast, I've actually got a friend in with me here, Raff, and we're going to be having a conversation about forgiveness. This is like the second part to last week's podcast on forgiveness. So in that episode, if you've not listened to it yet, jump in and listen to that first. And that is a little bit of teaching and thoughts on forgiveness. And today we're going to get really practical, and we're going to be talking about what we can do to process forgiveness and process through our hurts. So if you've not listened to podcast 1 on forgiveness, then please do that. This is kind of podcast 2. So let's jump in and talk about forgiveness. So Raff, you've got a really weird accent. Tell us where you're from.
Yeah, so I was born in Brazil, in Rio, to be specific. I came to the UK when I was 17 to 18 years old. So yeah, I'm not drunk, it's just my accent.
But you came to the UK at 18, but your journey to coming to the UK is not a straight one. Tell us a little bit about your story. What brought you to the UK?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. I actually came to the UK to escape from my family. Basically, I come from a family where, from high achievers, professionally speaking. My brother was a helicopter pilot, my dad was a lawyer, my mom was a dentist, and I was taking drugs. And because of that, there was a lot of pressure from my family. They were kind of interfering with my drug use, and I just wanted to use drugs in peace, if there was such a thing. So I came to the UK simply to escape from my family.
So you literally moved to the UK at 18 so you could take drugs and your parents would leave you alone.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not always the reason why people move to the UK.
Not really.
It's the sunshine.
Absolutely.
But you came because of the drugs.
Yeah.
So let's just rewind back then. Because I know you don't just turn up to the UK and decide to start taking drugs. What was it that led you down this path where that was your way of dealing with the pain?
Sure. I think that's a really good question. Lots of people, something I heard quite a few years ago, that the reason why many people struggle to get into recovery and to stay in recovery, as they say that it's easier to stop using drugs, the difficulty is to stay stopped. The problem is not to stop, the problem is to stay stopped. And the reason being is because I came to realize that drug was not my problem. Drug actually started as a solution to problems that existed prior to me trying. I think there are many factors. I think self-esteem was a big thing that I suffered with. I had very low self-esteem that happened because of certain episodes in my life. For example, there was lots of domestic violence at home. My parents got divorced when I was 7 years old. My father then disappeared for nearly 3 years. He didn't turn up on my birthdays. He didn't say anything, or Christmas time. And that made me feel that I wasn't worth it, that I wasn't lovable. And then, my first 2 relationships, romantic relationships, both of my girlfriends, they cheated on me with guys that I knew and that I hanged out with. So I kind of, I got abandoned by my father, and I got cheated by my first 2 ever girlfriends. So I grew up thinking that I wasn't worth it, I wasn't good enough, and, the neighbor's grass was always greener than mine. I always to be somebody else, somewhere else, or something else, and that was me. So I remember going to a party with my brother and his mates from the Air Force in Brazil. And they were all flirting and dancing and chatting with girls. And I remember looking at them thinking, how the hell do you do that? Because I just can't socialize. I was the kind of the guy that I would go to a club and sit on the back with my arms crossed, feeling like worse than everybody. I was so self-obsessed that I used to take my phone and act like I was speaking to someone when actually there was no one on that phone call. I just felt so embarrassed that I would rather act like if I was on a telephone call when actually there was no call happening. I just wanted to escape from reality. And what happened to this guy here is that once I took drugs, once I drank alcohol for the first time, alcohol and drugs allowed me to get away from all those, bad memories and the low self-esteem. So I don't know if that makes sense to whoever is listening to it, but drugs in the beginning, in a fake way, it gave me a sense of security, belonging. It was like the way I like to describe is, it was my best friend, but one day the best friend simply abandoned me. And then I was left with myself.
And, for you self-medicated on drugs. For some of us, we self-medicate on sex, porn, gambling. Some of us self-medicate on shopping. Make ourselves feel better. We're trying to fulfill something in us by shopping. There are lots of things we can consume in life to try and medicate this pain. Your story, in some ways, is an extreme one, but we all find it. It's true in all of us. We all do this, and if any one of us thinks that we don't do it, we are fooling ourselves. Can I just ask a little bit more about your dad and your mum? Because I know that your relationships, going right the way back, have been a key part of what you've needed to kind of work out. So can you just say something about your mum and dad's relationship and how that impacted you?
Sure, definitely. It was, as I normally say, on the external, it was great. We came from a wealthy family in Brazil. We lived in a mansion in Rio. Things looked amazing on the outside, but on the inside, our home was, severe domestic violence was a common theme. I saw my mom bleeding a few times. I saw my dad holding a shotgun to my mom's head when I was 5.5 to 6 years old. Abuse was a constant thing. My dad never laid a hand on me, but the way he behaved towards my mom, it was very scary. I remember vividly, like, how many times my mom used to cry and get panic attacks just by knowing that my father was arriving. And that, me and my brother, we would hide under the bed because my dad was coming. So that was like, that was common for us. It became like routine. My dad basically, after all that stuff, my dad, for example, he put my brother and myself in a situation where he used to cheat on my mom often, and he used to bring me and my brother to dates. So me and my brother were watching my father kissing another woman and having dinner with her, and then we would go home, and me and my brother would be in a situation where we didn't know what to say or do. And then, as I said previously, my father then left for I think it was between 2.5 and 3 years. I can't be exact on dates, to be honest, but I spoke to my mom about it in the past, and it's between 2.5 and 3 years that he disappeared completely. And when he came back, I remember like yesterday, I can remember as I speak, like I know exactly where I was sat, where he was, and I remember that my mom was there, and he was in my mom's house. But by that time, I'm grateful to my mom, because my mom, she never used the things my father did to separate us from our dad, which I believe it was a very honorable thing to do. She accepted my dad to come back regardless of what he did, just so me and my brother could have a father. And basically, as my father sat there, he didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't apologize or anything. He simply took a picture out of his pocket and showed me what was a sister that I didn't know I had, who was already nearly 3 years old, which basically means that that sister was born when he was still living with us. So he was living a secret life aside that we didn't know. And for me, especially as the youngest son, it was a shock. I was the youngest kid, and now all of a sudden I have a sister that actually is nearly 3. And I was very confused by it. I felt like cheated by my own father. Obviously, as a child, you don't have the maturity. I was jealous of my new sister. I think I lost my place as the youngest child. And then, there's a lot more. There's a lot more.
So there's so much in there that all of what was going on at home, plus the normal stuff that we go through as a teenager, led you to a place where it made more sense to take drugs than not to.
Yeah.
And for you, what was that process for you? Was it just a case of just jumping in? Was it a case of What was the movement from not taking drugs to taking drugs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I never thought I would use drugs. I never lacked information. I remember in Brazil, police officers, they normally used to come to the classes, just before you get to the teenage time, and they would show you the drugs and say to us what drugs could do in our lives and how bad it was. School itself used to do talks on drugs to kind of try and prevent people taking drugs. So I never thought I would use. But what happened is the first time, alcohol, obviously, I started drinking. I was quite young. I was about 13 years old when my brother went to the Air Force. And for some reason, my mom didn't challenge me, but it's not a blaming thing. Even if she did challenge, I don't think I would have stopped anyway. But drinking was fine for my family, and to cut a long story short, I was 13 years old. This very popular guy, he came to my friend's house where I was drinking beer. He was the kind of guy that everyone, well, at least I wanted to be. He was a good-looking guy. He had a beautiful girlfriend. He was 15 years old and had a motorbike, and his father was rich. And he just turns to me and say, "Raff, I've got a surprise for you. I have some cannabis in here." And I remember that actually I was petrified. Inside I was full of anxiety, and I wanted to tell him that actually I don't want to try. But for me, I wanted to please him. I wanted him to like me. And today, looking back, I can see that that's directly connected to have been abandoned by my father. I've spent years, even in recovery from drugs, I was able to realize that I was still seeking unavailable men. It's like if I was attracted to people that didn't pay attention on me. It's like if I wanted to buy their attention and their love. So yeah, that's something that happened, So I didn't want to try drugs. It's not like I've made a plan and I want to be a drug addict. I didn't. It was just like it started as I want you to like me. So
then 15 years go by.
Yeah, 14 years.
14 years, and that's then 14 years of medicating to try and run away from what happened in your childhood, this sense of not belonging, the sense of not having a father. So just run away from that and you run into the drugs. And the exciting thing is you're going to start training as a pastor at our church. And this is all exciting. So what happened from the moment where when you first went into a recovery meeting to actually starting to find recovery, what happened in that? What's the pieces that were played out that helped you? Yeah,
it was really interesting. You mentioned previously about 5 minutes ago that although my thing was drugs, we all are recovering from something. Some people are shopping, some people are sex. And what I see personally, this is my experience, on the place where I found recovery. It's a 12-step fellowship, for those of you that know what 12 steps is. And they have a saying in there that we all suffer from a spiritual void. And that void is a God-shaped void. So whatever else I put in there, that void won't be fulfilled. Like Jesus says that he's the bread of life, no other bread will fulfill me. So my story in recovery is that I found freedom from drugs, and I was in what we call a pink cloud. So for the first 6 months of recovery, I felt like, yes, that's it. I'm the happiest man on earth now, and I'm no longer addicted to drugs. And I started to externally look better. I put some weight on. I was having some money in my pocket. Things started to feel good. But eventually, I found myself exactly how I felt when I was 13 years old, and I felt so self-obsessed. I found myself in recovery acting like if I was on a phone call, but actually there was no one on the other side of the line, exactly how I felt when I was in a club at the age of 13. And what I realized is that actually I now don't have a drug problem, but I have a me problem. I have a lot of underlying issues that I was self-medicating on. And it's similar to people who suffer from depression, and they are taking antidepressants, but they're not doing therapy. They're not having counseling, or they are not dealing with what caused the depression in the first place. So what happens is drugs was numbing it, but the problem was still under the carpet. So what happened to me is basically I found myself with 2 years clean, without any drugs, including alcohol, because my part of my journey is that I found out that I couldn't drink alcohol as well. And what happened is I was 2 years complete abstinent from all drugs, and I felt miserable. I was no longer smoking cannabis or crack, but I was smoking lust. I was no longer sniffing cocaine, but I was sniffing resentments and being judgmental. I swapped drugs for other things. I started to watch pornography multiple times a day. I was having sex with 4 different girls at the same time without protecting myself. I realized that basically drug was not the problem. I realized that spiritual void that drugs was fulfilling was now a big gap again. And I realized after 2.5 years in recovery, after being challenged by a guy who was a pastor, that the reason why I felt so miserable is because I was trying to fill that gap with things that would always leave me thirsty no matter how much I drank from it. And he told me that only Jesus would fulfill that void. But Jesus was the last thing I wanted because of experience I had previously in life. My experience from church is that church was a place to get manipulated and put your money in the basket. And especially, the story. I had the church I attended in Brazil, the pastor was having an affair with 3 or 4 ladies from the congregation. And then my father was beating up my mom from Monday to Saturday, and then on Sunday would put a smile face and go to church. So I kind of I was against church, and but I guess I was so broken and so lost and so empty and I didn't want to go back to drugs again, because I knew that drugs wasn't going to answer the problem no more. So I think the pain became so great that I became willing to try something that I didn't want to. And my story is that when I found Jesus, not religion, but when I found Jesus, and I no longer needed to seek my father's love because I found my real father.
And this is where we kind of lead on to. So we're talking about forgiveness, and there's so much in your story, but what I want to focus on today is how did you get to a place where you could forgive your father? The root, not the root, but a part of the root of your addiction comes from the abuse that you saw at home and you saw your dad doing to your mum. So talk me through what does forgiveness and what has this process looked like for you as you've processed it in your recovery? Sure,
that's really good actually, and I like to be very practical about stuff. I think that, and I'm not. It's not a critic. I think. I have been to many churches in the past where you go and you hear a lot about the Bible, but sometimes it feels like so far away that you leave church more confused than when you entered. So putting in a very practical way, how was I able to forgive my father? I would like to divide these in 3 different ways, which is called feel, deal, and then heal.
So for those that don't know Brazilian, I'll translate. That's feel, deal, and heal.
That's right. And the reason why I like to divide in those 3 areas, you guys are going to realize why. So the problem for me at first was actually not allowing myself to feel it, not allowing myself to actually express how hurt I was.
So this is what happened with your dad.
Exactly.
At home. Yeah.
And my dad, and also anything in life, any resentments I had, including the first 2 girlfriends that cheated on me. What happened to me is because I was young and I didn't have maturity, I didn't know how to process my feelings. So all I did, like most people in society today do, not just kids, but even adults, is people just put a mask and they pretend that everything is okay. Like people say, man up. I grew up thinking that if you are a man, you don't cry. If you are a man, you don't talk about your feelings. The more vulnerable you get, the more people are gonna abuse you, and which actually is a very unhealthy thing to be told. And what I did is, I wasn't able to feel properly in a healthy way. And what happened is it started coming out in very unhealthy manners. I've got tattoos all over my body. I started taking drugs. I was looking for the wrong girlfriends. I was looking for the wrong friends. It's interesting because my mom used to blame lots of my friends. And I lived in 6 different cities around the world, right? I lived in Portugal, in Scotland, England, Brazil. And everywhere I went, I always found the same friends. So it's not the friends that was the problem, it was my choices, And it was always coming because of that, It was all linked to this sense of low self-esteem and, feeling abandoned and so on. So, yeah, the feeling part of it basically is for you guys to know the process, right? When I found recovery, I had to list every single resentment I had in life. All of them, my mom, my dad, my brother, even very tiny resentments, when you were a kid in school and people call you a name that you don't like. So I had to look at all that stuff. And it was, and the way it works is you have to put on a notebook the name of the person, what they did, not what you think they did, but what they did, facts only, and then how that affected me, and then what was my part. So the name of the person, what they have done, how you affected me, and my part. In many examples, finding my part wasn't difficult. For example, I had a resentment with my mother that she kicked me out of the house. But when I looked at my part, it wasn't difficult to see. I stole money from her. I was bringing drama to her house because of my drug use. So it was easy to kind of see that I had a big part to play. But when it came to the situation that I remember that I wrote that, my father, what he did, basically on my 8th birthday, I was really hoping that he would turn up, and all my friends were in the house, all of their parents came, and the only father that didn't turn up was my own. And that for me was like, your superhero didn't turn up. I was gutted, I was broken by that. And I didn't even have a phone number to call. And I remember my mentor who was taking me through this process, he asked me, he said, what's your part? And I was really angry with him. We had a small argument where I said, how can you ask me my part when I was 8 years old? And his question was, how old are you now? And I said to him, well, I was 26 at the time. And he said, your part is holding a resentment without dealing with it for the next 18 years. He said, you could have done nothing then, but you had 18 years to look for help and to talk and to, whatever way to process that, which leads me to the next part now, which is the deal. So the feeling, the problem, as I said, it wasn't expressing my feelings appropriately. So the dealing part with it, as I said, I don't need to go over again because I've just expressed how I dealt with it. So I had to find somebody that was healthy, somebody that, you have to be very careful who you speak to. If you've got a toothache and you go to the lawyer, it's very little he can do for you. So I think it's very important to know who we talk to, because if I want to forgive somebody and I go to someone that can't forgive, they won't help me to forgive. They're going to help me to be more bitter. And I didn't want to be more bitter because I knew that all those bitterness and all those stuff was going to bring me back to drugs again. So this mentor was a healthy guy that, the main focus of this dealing part, it wasn't to blame others, it was to find my part in it so I can grow and change. So yeah, he told me, he said, listen, this is what you've got to do. He said, you've got to look at your part, and the other thing was, there's 3 things in this dealing area, okay? Years back, my mom told me that my father, so the same guy that I have resented for so many years, when he was 6 years old, he was abandoned by his own mom. So his mom chose his brother, escaped to another country, and left my father alone. He didn't even know where his mom was. And we're talking about 1960. She just escaped to another continent. And I was thinking, you can only borrow money if you have it, and you can only give love if you have love. So I was expecting my father to give me something that he did not have. And that allowed me, helped me to see that actually we are all carrying baggages.
Yeah.
You know, I was blessed to be introduced to a process that allowed me to break those chains. You know, like my kids will no longer carry that. You know, I had the opportunity to actually break through those chains, you know, with the help of this process and, you know, the Holy Spirit and everything in it, to don't keep passing on this curse into the next generation. You know, so yeah, the dealing part was that, you know, I had to look into those resentments. Basically, like the quote that kind of summarized this is, pretending that you are not hurt does not mean that you are not hurt. You know, we are very good at pretending stuff. But what happens is, every time I pretend, I'm putting one more stone in my pocket. And the more stones I have, the more down I go. You know, so I had to let go of those stones and pick one at a time from my pocket. And that's what that process done with me. And the last part, which is the healing part that I want to explain is, so I have admitted my feelings. You know, I have shown that actually, yes, I was hurt by what my father did. And yes, I feel like I was, you know, not lovable, and he affected me so much. And I was angry with him, you know, so I had to stop pretending. The dealing part was obviously, as I said, I had to look at my part, and I also had to look that actually my father was carrying his own baggages. And after the next part is, through that process, I wrote from my first ever memory in life to my last ever memory in life. So I remember writing about what my father was doing, but then later, when I came to my own adult life, I started to realize that actually I long for forgiveness. You know, I need to be forgiven in so many areas. You know, like I stole from my family, I've committed crime, and you know how they say that, you know, when you realize your need to be forgiven, you become more forgiven. You know, so I realized that if I wanted to be forgiven myself, I must be able to offer forgiveness to others. You know, I'm not more special than anyone. You know, the same way I had excuses for my behaviors, my father had his excuses too. Yeah. You know, and I think it's very important, Cris, for people to know that to forgive does not mean that you forgot. You know, every time I talk about my father, especially being a father myself, I think, how can you, you know, how was he able to do that? Because I can't even imagine leaving my kids in here. Do you know what I mean? The only reason I live in the UK today is because of my kids. Otherwise, I would have gone back to Brazil a long time ago. You know, so every time I think of it, not every time, but there are times when I talk about it that I kind of struggle. But so forgiving is not forgetting. Forgiving is remembering. But each time I remember, I decide to forgive anyway. Because I know that, you know, resentment is like if I am drinking poison, expecting my dad to die. But actually, who is dying is me, because I'm the one bitter.
So this is really important. So forgiveness is not a one-time silver bullet.
Yeah.
It's a daily process of I choose to forgive today.
Absolutely.
And I choose to forgive today. And as time goes by, that gets deeper. It looks different, but it has to be a regular choice, doesn't it? Because you can keep going back to resentment without even realizing it.
Absolutely. Especially if I don't look after my spirituality.
Yeah.
You know, if I don't read my Bible enough, if I don't connect with God enough, you know, it's a daily surrender, isn't it? It's like a relationship with God. You know, I know many people that are Christian for decades and they became atheists because they didn't look after their spirituality. And with forgiveness is the same. You know, I think of it sometimes, but every time I think, I look at three things. I look at what was done to my dad. I look at things I've done and I wanted to be forgiven from, and I look at the cross, you know, because what the cross shows us is that actually, you know, God, through his son, Jesus, he saved us from a price that we would never be able to pay back. You know, and if he done that for us, who am I not to offer the same to others, you know?
Can I ask you a question before, just as we end? Forgiveness is not easy. How easy was it to forgive your dad?
There is a saying that says when the pain becomes greater, when the pain of remaining the same becomes greater than the pain of changing, we become willing. Okay? So for me, what happened is I understood that resentment was not damaging my father. It was damaging me. It was damaging my relationship with God. I don't know exactly where in the Bible, but there is a passage that says that before you bring your offers to the altar, go there and deal with your resentment.
Yeah.
And I really get what God is saying, because for me, when I'm bitter, when I'm angry, that blocks me from praying, that blocks me from contacting with God.
That's good.
So yeah.
That's amazing, Raff. Thank you so much. I love this. Feel, deal, heal.
Yeah.
Feel the pain, work through it, deal with it. Don't hide it. Don't push it down. You push that pain down, it becomes depression, becomes anxiety. That's when it becomes addiction. Dealing with it, looking at it in the light with other people, with Jesus, and then that actually leads to the healing. I think if we can implement that, to feel the pain, process and deal with it, and get to healing, that's a great thing. We're going to leave it there. Yeah. Thank you so much, Raff. I'd love to have loads of more conversations with you about this kind of stuff. I think you've got so much to offer us. Look, if you're listening to this podcast today and you have heard Raff's story about his upbringing, about what he's gone through, how he's processed it, any of that, then don't just leave it. If you need to talk it through with somebody else, then please talk it through. Find somebody that you can talk that through from. We'd love to hear your comments. Leave a little comment after this podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what Raff has been saying. But for me, that treasure is feel, deal, heal. That's something that's worth memorizing. I'm going to choose to feel this pain. I'm going to choose to deal with it. And through that, then we can find healing. Friends, until next time, look after yourselves, and grace and peace.